Good afternoon. Glad you're here. We're celebrating Los Altos Union Church's 100th anniversary. 100 years of God being faithful to his people. 100 years of progress. As Joel has put together, you'll see this is a great video about the history of Los Altos and how Union fits into it. How we have grown and changed as the world has grown and changed. And through all that time, God has been very faithful to us. He's continued to be with us, guide us, lead us. So we're thankful. This is a thankful day. Thankful to our God, thankful to one another. Have a good day.
I'm Joel Richert, and I began worshiping at Union Presbyterian Church in 1966. Much has happened during the past 48 years, but in this video I'll go back even further to when a small group of people decided to begin a Sunday worship service over a century ago. This church has been led by 10 pastors, and I will introduce them all and describe some of the events that were taking place locally and elsewhere. It was a pastor's role to help the parishioners through the good and the bad times. I will then describe what our church is doing at this time to spread the gospel of Jesus to others. I will leave you with a challenge to predict what Los Altos and the Union Church will be like in another 100 years. I want to thank Pastor Dave for his guidance in this project. A good place to start the history of Los Altos is the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906. It caused enormous destruction and disruption of the city. A man that became a key person in the development of Los Altos, Paul Shope, was at that time employed by the Southern Pacific Railroad. He was in charge of developing the interurban electrical railroad to connect Palo Alto with Los Altos. The track was to go through land owned by Sarah Winchester, widow of the Winchester rifle manufacturer. Since the right-of-way would divide her farm, she insisted he buy the entire farm. Paul eventually agreed to this arrangement and soon thereafter formed a land development company to sell the excess land as lots to builders in the Los Altos area. The electric trolley was in operation in 1907. The trolley brought shoppers from the rural areas to Palo Alto. A parallel track for steam trains followed and took passengers to and from San Francisco. The electric trolley was abandoned in 1933 because automobiles had replaced its usefulness. The iron tracks were removed and recycled. Diesel trains replaced the steam trains, but they were also discontinued in 1964, and the railroad was converted into the Foothill Expressway. During the time the trains were operating, a nice station was built, which still stands. Through the years, it has had many lives, but during the past year, it has had extensive renovation. It is now a bakery and restaurant. Paul Shope built a home which still stands at 500 University Avenue in Los Altos. He was an unusually talented man with only a high school education. He began working for the Southern Pacific Railroad in 1891 as a ticket clerk. His talents were recognized, and he progressed to become president of the company in 1929. In addition, he was involved in numerous other projects, including founding of the Stanford University Graduate School of Business. His photo appeared on the cover of Time magazine August 12, 1929. He had a two-story building constructed on the corner of Main and 2nd Street in Los Altos. A bank now uses this building. He donated land located behind his home and along Adobe Creek to the city of Los Altos, and it has been named Shope Park. He died in 1946, and his ashes are in a vault at the Alta Mesa Memorial Park in Palo Alto. Guy Shope was the older brother of Paul Shope, who trained as a lawyer and also worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Guy and his wife, Adele, were longtime members of the Union Church. Their Los Altos home still stands near Paul's at 452 University Avenue. As I will tell later, he played an active role in helping Union Church become a legal entity recognized by the state of California in 1914. I will now take you on a brief photo tour of Los Altos to show you how things have changed over the past century and to show future people what the city looked like in 2014. The Paul Shope building was constructed on the corner of Main and 2nd Street in 1909. His brother-in-law operated a grocery store in the ground floor, and the second floor was a meeting room for groups. A school teacher taught 8 grades of school in the room. It has survived for a century and is now occupied by a bank. The Copeland building was constructed in 1911 on the corner of Main and 1st Street. It now houses a sports bar, but over the years it has served a drugstore, the post office, a movie theater, and a number of restaurants. The second floor was originally used by the Copelands as their living quarters. I have already shown you how the original train depot is now a newly refurbished restaurant. 1st Street has a recently completed condominium building, and a second is still under construction. A new Safeway grocery and a multi-purpose building are also under construction on 1st Street between Main and West Edith. A boutique hotel is under construction at the corner of Main Street and San Antonio. It will be the first hotel in Los Altos. Other current features are a large library, the Los Altos History Museum, and the Bus Barn Theater. When I first came to Los Altos, I attended movies in the theater on Main Street. At present, it is a stationery store. The city library had a humble beginning at various locations, including this unsightly building. This ivy-covered building was built to house the electric generating plant to power the trolley line that ran between Palo Alto and Los Gatos. The ivy was stripped away and the interior rebuilt to house the library that continued to grow in the number of books available. The building was eventually demolished to make way for the first Safeway grocery store. Within the past year, the original Safeway was demolished to make way for a new and larger store, which is scheduled for completion in July of this year. Foothill Community College opened the first campus in 1961. A second campus, De Anza, opened in Cupertino in 1967. The 2 campuses now serve over 17,000 undergraduates. This photo of Main Street is about 1910, shows the forms of transportation to be horse and buggy and Model T Ford. One of our most modern automobiles at this time is the all-electric Tesla. I've obtained photos of bicycles of the 1910 period to compare with 2014. Bicycles have become very popular and the clothing is very colorful. Women now use the same bicycle that men use. Foothill Expressway serves as a vital road that has been supplemented by another vital road, Interstate Highway 280, which takes heavy traffic between San Francisco and San Jose. What started as a small rural community a century ago has matured into a thriving residential and business city with a population in 2010 of 28,976. There have been 10 pastors who have served the church that started with a small group of worshipers that first met in 1909. I will introduce all 10 pastors, but with a severe time limit. Most pastors did not publish their sermons, nor were they recorded on videos. That leaves very little to say except the years that they served. I have chosen to tell what local, national, or international circumstances existed that caused them to fashion their sermons in order to help the worshipers deal with these problems. It amounts to a very brief history of the past 100 years. The first pastor to lead the small group of worshipers was Reverend O.M. Hester, a retired Methodist pastor. They met in the only available meeting place, the upstairs room of the building which still stands on the corner of Main and 2nd Street. The building was built by Paul Shoup and still goes by that name. It served many purposes through the years and now houses the U.S. Bank. Photos of that period show a horse and buggy as well as a Model T Ford auto. Railroads had become a major form of transportation. Roads were unpaved, and depending upon the weather, they were either muddy or dusty. San Francisco was still recovering from the 1906 earthquake and fire that destroyed so much of the city. Reverend George Hunter, also a retired minister, took over the leadership of the group from Reverend Hester, and the meeting place was changed to the assembly room of the new San Antonio School building. On Easter Sunday, March 23, 1913, the group met to form the Union Church of Los Altos. They drew up articles of faith and elected officers. When they began investigating the purchase of property upon which to build a church building, they found they lacked the legal status necessary to proceed. They met again on Tuesday, April 14, 1914, and with the help of Guy Shoup, an attorney, the legal steps for incorporation were fulfilled. It has become the date by which we measure our centennial year. By the end of 1914, they had collected funds and completed the construction of the Little Brown Church. Pastor Hunter retired for the second time shortly after the building was completed. This structure served the Union Church for 43 years until the present church was occupied in 1957. World War I broke out suddenly in Europe in July 1914. The Panama Canal opened on August 15, 1914. The world was becoming a very active environment. Reverend Hill was a young seminary graduate that spent only 2 years as Union's pastor. He came as a single man but was married at the end of his term. His wife attended only one service before they left for Korea to spend the rest of his career as a missionary. An event in San Francisco attracted crowds. It was the Panama Pacific International Exposition to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914. The beautiful Legion of Honor remains as a memorial to the expo. It was originally built as a temporary structure, but San Franciscans refused to see it destroyed and saved it with extensive repairs. The war in Europe continued with a stalemate of trench warfare in which there were enormous numbers of dead and wounded on both sides. Pastor Landell spent 23 years as leader of the congregation. His background was unusual in that he was born and educated in England. He served churches in Glasgow and Newcastle-on-Tyne for 18 years before immigrating to the U.S. He then led a congregation in Ottawa, Illinois for 5 years before coming to live on a ranch near San Jose. He began his leadership of Union Church just after the U.S. became involved in World War I. The war had been underway for 3 years before America entered with 2 million soldiers. The war ended with the cost of 53,000 American battle deaths. The trench warfare in retrospect seems so irrational. It can be illustrated by a story told to me by the superintendent of the American cemetery at Flanders in Belgium. On November 10, 1918, the day before the war ended, there was a hard-fought battle with the Germans on the 6-acre site of the cemetery. There were 368 Americans killed, and I have always wondered how the grieving relatives must have felt to lose a loved one on the day before the war ended. Following the war, President Wilson made many unsuccessful attempts to negotiate a lasting peace. The harsh peace terms for Germany resulted in severe inflation and resentment among the people that Adolf Hitler used to his advantage. The influenza pandemic of 1918 caused an estimated 20 million deaths worldwide, with 548,000 in the U.S. The war was followed by the Roaring Twenties. The Model T Ford was replaced by the Model A, and many other automakers entered the market. Highways were improved. Industrial technology brought better airplanes, radios, and movies. Jazz music and new forms of dancing were introduced. There was a feeling of exuberance. Noted authors gathered in Paris to write novels of a decadent society. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic Ocean in May 1927. Everywhere there seemed to be change and prosperity until Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. The stock market crash erased the easy money and began the worldwide Great Depression. Herbert Hoover was president and thought the economy would recover without government help. Franklin D. Roosevelt became president in 1933 and introduced many governmental programs, which helped, but prosperity did not return until World War II began in Europe, when Hitler sent the German army into Poland in September 1939. America, with its industrial might, found an enormous demand for its products. The misery of the Depression and the dust storms of the Midwest farms ended with reemployment of the workforce. San Francisco was doing its share by building both the Bay Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge, and celebrated in 1939 by displaying Treasure Island and the Golden Gate International Exposition. President Roosevelt knew that America could not avoid involvement in the war and began the military draft. Pastor Landell served the Union Church through these historic events, but retired in 1940 at the age of 78. He published a well-received book of poetry in 1946. A meeting room in the present church is named after him. Pastor Coburn was only able to serve the church for a year before he was called to serve as a chaplain in the Army Air Corps. After Pastor Coburn's abrupt departure to serve as a chaplain in the Air Corps, there happened to be a retired minister living in Palo Alto. He was Reverend Arthur H. Bailey and his wife, who had moved there following the terrible loss of their home on Cape Cod in a fire caused by lightning. All of their possessions were destroyed, including a manuscript of a book ready for publication. Pastor Bailey served the Union Church through most of World War II and the early post-war years. The war had the most casualties of any conflict in the history of the world. Accurate statistics are impossible, but it is estimated that there were over 60 million deaths, or 2.5% of the world population living at that time. Japan had been preparing for war, but the most blame for starting the conflict falls on Adolf Hitler for invading Poland on September 1, 1939. Over 16 million men and women served in the American Armed Forces during the war, and suffered 291,557 battle deaths. Details of the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the Holocaust were so horrible that it is hard to imagine it could have happened at the hands of a modern country. There were 5 to 6 million Jews and other undesirables, as they were called, killed by starvation or other methods. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. The Bay Area played a big role in providing transport ships to carry all of the materials and personnel to Europe and Asia. The combined shipyards were able to launch 3 ships a day. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, Japan made rapid conquests in the Pacific Theater. However, only 6 months later, in June 1942, Japan suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Midway. After that, they were on the defensive until they surrendered following the A-bombs which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. President Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and was replaced by Harry Truman, who was forced to make many important decisions during the early post-war period. This included dealing with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. It fell to historians to give Truman the credit he deserved for his decisions to help Germany and Japan rebuild. The returning servicemen and servicewomen began their families in what became known as the baby boomers. In numbers, they were like a tsunami wave that required more schools and colleges, and they caused generational conflicts. The boomers seemed unaware of the hardships their parents' generation suffered during the Depression, dust storms, and World War II. Americans were quick to demobilize their large army, and the communists saw this as an opportunity. The cherished world peace only lasted 5 years. The communist government of North Korea, backed by the communist governments of China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950. President Truman was able to get the UN Security Council to authorize military action. I was stationed in a hospital in Japan. From there, I was attached to the 7th Infantry Division and sent to Korea. We used helicopters to evacuate seriously wounded soldiers for the first time. This motley group of medical officers looks like they are from the movie MASH. I am the farthest one on the left. Peace negotiations dragged on for 3 years. American combat deaths in Korea totaled 33,739. Ever since then, North Korea has been a source of international tension. It was during Pastor Bailey's term that it was decided that the Little Brown Church needed to expand, so funds were collected and the Parish Hall addition was built. It was soon realized that the Parish Hall would not provide the church's need for a larger sanctuary. Mrs. Bailey died in 1950, and Pastor Bailey resigned in March 1952 because of failing health. He died in 1955. In their wills, they left the church $80,000. Translated into current dollars, it would amount to approximately $700,000. The social room in the current church is named after him. After Pastor Bailey's resignation in 1952 for health reasons, Reverend Stuart Harro and his family happened to be in the area on vacation. The Harros had friends in the area that convinced him to allow them to submit his name as a replacement for Pastor Bailey. Negotiations progressed rapidly, and he was invited to fill the position. Reverend Harro had served as associate pastor at the First Presbyterian Church of Sharon, Pennsylvania, for 6 years, and before that he served as a Navy chaplain for 2 years in the Pacific Theater. He was a graduate of Wheaton College and Dallas Theological Seminary. He began his duties at Union Church in August 1952. Over the decades, Los Altos had experienced a steady growth of population, which brought people of various denominations who would start new churches. Some of the Union Church members would transfer membership because of previous affiliations. Nevertheless, the Little Brown Church was outgrowing its capacity. There had been an extensive fundraising campaign which, along with the efforts of talented church members, resulted in a plan to buy 6 acres of land and start construction of the present church and manse located on University Avenue. Construction had already begun when Reverend Harro became pastor, but his services began in the Little Brown Church. The manse was finished before the church, and the Harro family moved into their new home and watched as the church building progressed. Thereafter, as long as he was pastor, he could point out details of construction and the location of shut-off valves. The first service in the new church was held on Sunday, September 8, 1957. Reverend Harro's daughter, Gretchen, tells in her own way how her father convinced the Union Church of Los Altos to become the Union Presbyterian Church of Los Altos.
During this segment, I'd like to talk about some difficult times that my dad experienced when he was a pastor in the church. The church was floundering as to what it believed in, as there were members of the church who were unhappy with my dad's conservative doctrinal stance. And I remember that at one point there were letters that were sent out from members of the church to each other and to Dad, and they weren't even signed when they were put in our mailbox. My parents go through this wrenching experience. I can remember the second time that my dad simply said, at the end of the sermon, when I finish the sermon today, I want you and Jenny to sit in the front row with Mom, and then we'll leave the church before the service is over, and you'll understand why. He didn't tell me the reason. We were sitting in the front row, and when Dad finished the sermon, he gave his resignation to the congregation. And he came down out of the pulpit, and we walked down the aisle together out of the church. And then we drove to my grandparents' house in San Mateo. And my grandmother said to us, "What happened this time?" And I thought that that would be the time that we would depart. But after that, there were people in the church who just simply left and formed their own church or went to other churches where the doctrine was more to their liking. So I remember the spiritual struggles going on, and how Dad would always stick to his guns, and he would say, "Fine, if you don't want me here anymore, I'll leave." But I'm thankful that the church came through those days and with a good, sound foundation, spiritual foundation. In this segment, I want to explain about my father's affiliation with the Presbyterian Church. We originally came from Pennsylvania in 1952 out to a church that did not have a denominational affiliation. And he was seconded to this Union Church in Los Altos in 1952. I said in the previous segment that he resigned twice due to doctrinal differences. The last time that he resigned, the second time, he did not leave the church. He said that the condition of him staying on would be that the church would become a Presbyterian church affiliated with the PCUSA. And this is what happened after his resignation. The church met together and decided that they would go with this denomination.
Many events were taking place in this and other countries around the world. The Korean War ended in 1953 with unhappiness on both sides, which kept American troops in South Korea ever since. President Eisenhower replaced President Truman in 1953. The Korean negotiations were essentially settled, and he was able to enjoy a lull in warfare during the remainder of his 2 terms in office. In 1957, William Hewlett and David Packard, graduates of Stanford University, began Hewlett-Packard Company, dealing in electronic equipment. They began a local tradition of starting in a garage. HP is now a leading maker of computers and computer hardware in the world with 317,500 employees. John F. Kennedy became president in January 1961. Civil rights protests were widespread in the South. Space flights had started. In October 1962, the president was confronted by the Cuban Missile Crisis with the Soviet Union. Also in October 1962, Pope John XXIII began the Second Vatican Council, which modernized many things in the Catholic Church. Martin Luther King led the March on Washington in August 1963. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas on November 22, 1963. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. The calmness of the Eisenhower years was replaced by disruptions and violence coming from many places. Congress passed the War on Poverty bill. It was later said that poverty won the war. In 1965, President Johnson ordered the bombing of North Vietnam. Medicare began July 1, 1966. There was further warfare in Vietnam and Cambodia. A large anti-war march took place in October 1967, led by baby boomers. Senator Robert Kennedy was assassinated June 5, 1968. In 1968, 2 local engineers, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, left Fairchild Company and started their own company, which became Intel. They were the first to produce the single-chip microprocessor. It is the basic part of computers and has made possible the wonders of electronics. In 10 years, the company was employing 10,000 people. Medical electronics was a necessary part of the heart transplant work pioneered at Stanford University in 1968. President Nixon began his first term in 1969. On July 20th, 1969, astronauts landed on the moon. Anti-Vietnam War demonstrations became larger and more violent. In 1970, the anti-war demonstrations resulted in deaths on 2 college campuses. In 1972, President Nixon visited Communist China and the Soviet Union to encourage overcoming the Cold War, as the hostility with communist countries was called. President Nixon resigned the presidency August 8, 1974, over the Watergate scandals. In 1976, David Wozniak and Steve Jobs began making personal computers in the garage of Jobs' parents' Los Altos home. They named their company Apple Computer. IBM, Adobe, and many other electronics firms located in the Santa Clara Valley and the area has become known the world over as Silicon Valley. Stanford University and Stanford Research Institute provided many of the intellectuals that have continued to produce better and faster computers and a host of new instruments. Most of these devices have contributed much good to the world, but some have contributed to negative aspects in human behavior. Jimmy Carter became president in 1977. One of his first actions was to pardon the Vietnam-era draft evaders. The disruption of American society by the draft evaders and Vietnam War protesters split the country. Thereafter, the military draft was abandoned in favor of voluntary recruitment that has persisted to the present time. Relations with Iran have never recovered from the Iran hostage crisis which happened during Carter's presidency. Pastor Harro served the church for 25 tumultuous years, and he retired in December 1977. He served the longest of any pastor to date. I came with my family in 1966, and we enjoyed the remaining years of his service. The stained glass figure of Jesus holding a lamb, which is located above the choir, was obtained in his honor. After Reverend Harro retired, it took 15 months to call a replacement, and during that time there were 4 interim pastors. During the time the church was not affiliated with a denomination, it only took a few weeks. The process of finding a new pastor in the Presbyterian church has a rather strict protocol with time-consuming steps. Presbyterian pastors are members of the presbytery and not the church they serve. Both the presbytery and the congregation want there to be a good fit. Reverend Meads is a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary. He had been associate pastor of Menlo Park Presbyterian Church before he accepted the call to come to Los Altos. He served Union Presbyterian Church for 13 years during a period when there was still not peace in the world. There was, however, good news in Silicon Valley. Information technology, or IT as it is called, was making progress at an unbelievable pace. In 1979, the Iran government under Ayatollah Khomeini took 66 Americans hostage in the American embassy. President Carter ordered an attempt to rescue them with an embarrassing failure. The Russians in 1980 invaded Afghanistan, and the president refused to send American athletes to Moscow for the Summer Olympics. Ronald Reagan became president in January 1981. In June 1982, the first case of AIDS was reported by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. In 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after takeoff. In 1987, President Reagan produced the first trillion-dollar budget. In December 1987, President Reagan and the Russian leader Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to reduce the number of long-range missiles. The Cold War was beginning to show improvement. George H.W. Bush was installed president in January 1989. On October 17, 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake damaged the Bay Area and caused 63 deaths. In 1991, the U.S. and our allies in the Persian Gulf War defeated Iraq in its attempt to overtake Kuwait. There were 53 deaths in riots in Los Angeles in April 1992 after police officers, which beat Rodney King, were acquitted. In the presidential race of 1992, Bill Clinton defeated the re-election of President Bush. It was during Pastor Meade's service that a much-needed and much-appreciated addition was added to the church building. It is a two-story structure with offices and a workroom on the main floor and meeting rooms and a choir room on the second floor. Pastor Meades finished his 13-year term in June 1992. Reverend Clark began his term in March 1994. He has an undergraduate degree in psychology from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He received a Master of Divinity degree from Fuller Theological Seminary. He was pastor of a church in Morgan Hill before accepting the call to Union Presbyterian Church. Some of the issues which occurred during his term are as follows. In January 1994, a pre-dawn earthquake hit Los Angeles with considerable destruction and the loss of 61 lives. An American, Timothy McVeigh, set off a truck bomb which exploded outside the Oklahoma City Federal Building in April 1995, which caused a loss of 168 lives. A budget impasse between Congress and President Clinton caused a temporary shutdown of the government in 1995. In 1998, President Clinton was accused of improper conduct by several women and was impeached by the House of Representatives, but the vote failed in the Senate. In 1999, two students from Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, killed 12 fellow students and a teacher before killing themselves. Scientists from the U.S. and Britain announced in 2000 that they had determined the structure of the human genome. In the November presidential election that year, the vote count in Florida was so close that George W. Bush was not declared the winner until December 12th. On September 11, 2001, two airliners were hijacked by al-Qaeda terrorists and crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers. A third plane crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth crashed in a field from near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Approximately 3,000 people were killed in these attacks. America, along with other nations, launched air and ground attacks on terrorist training bases in Afghanistan in October 2001. This war has continued for almost 13 years. The U.S. also launched a war in Iraq in March 2003. The Iraq conflict progressed into a civil war between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. The U.S. withdrew its troops in December 2011. The Iraq War caused approximately 4,500 American deaths. President Obama was elected in 2008. Same-sex marriages became legal in some states, but California passed Proposition 8, which outlawed the same-sex marriages. After many legal challenges, Proposition 8 was invalidated and same-sex marriages in California resumed. Church denominations had to deal with the same-sex marriage issues, and they began to split on this and other issues. The Presbyterian Church USA stepped into this arena and began a three-way split. During Pastor Clark's term, the church built a second manse to help ministers who could not afford local prices for homes or rentals. He also began 2 worship services. The early service began with breakfast and families gathered together at tables to enjoy an informal worship service. It became very popular with families. However, it left the second service with the older members who felt isolated from the younger members and were not able to learn to know them. Pastor Clark ended his 14-year term in March 2008. Pastor David Moore came to us in December 2011, after the longest interval between pastors in the church's history. It was 3 years and 8 months. There have been 2 interim pastors, but the delay took a toll in the church membership. Pastor Dave graduated from Pepperdine University, where his father was a professor. After trying to find the work that inspired him, he was attracted to his mother's work, Christian ministry. He graduated from Fuller Seminary and was ordained in the Presbyterian Church. Prior to his current calling, he served a church on Long Island for 8 years. In international affairs, the Middle East is in the midst of turmoil that has not been seen in the past century. There is civil war in Syria and in Iraq between the Shia and Sunni Muslims. Israel is at war with the Hamas faction of the Palestinians. Christians are being martyred unless they convert to the Muslim faith. Pastor Dave comes to serve Union Presbyterian Church at a time when the Presbyterian Church USA is breaking into 3 denominations over differences in what the Bible teaches about Christian beliefs and behavior. He comes with a strong message on the traditional position on biblical interpretations. Union Presbyterian Church of Los Altos has voted to withdraw from the Presbyterian Church USA and join the Eco-Presbyterian denomination. The name Eco refers to a covenant order of evangelical Presbyterians. Over the past century, there have been many associate pastors, assistant pastors, and interim pastors, which will be named on a slide. The past century has been through many wars and has witnessed unbelievable changes in communication, transportation, and space exploration. Human health and survival has made advances which could not have been imagined 100 years ago. Our pastors are to be congratulated for leading us through the troubled waters and helping us appreciate the good times. Now the challenge will be to predict what life will be like a century from now. The church is involved in many activities that will be enumerated on a slide. Time does not allow me to describe all of them, but some of them can be represented by photos. The missions and missionaries that we support will be named, and a brief description of their work and where it takes place will be shown. Our church has been generous in support of missionaries and organizations that have as their goal to help the poor and the needy. At present, 22% of the income from voluntary offerings is given to missions. In addition, there are designated gifts for specific missionaries or specific projects. The total averages about $10,000 per month. There are at present 37 missionaries or organizations to which we contribute. The Missions Committee maintains a close relationship with the people and organizations that we support. Our desire is to have missionaries report in person when they're available and for the members of the congregation to learn to know them. Many of those we support were affiliated with our church before becoming missionaries, and in this we take great pride. About half of our support goes to workers and organizations within the U.S. We also support workers in Mexico, Africa, Bulgaria, Pakistan, Spain, Thailand, Japan, India, Peru, China, Belgium, and England. I've been a long-time member of the Missions Committee, and I am pleased that I have heard no members of the congregation suggest that we reduce our giving. The Missions Committee recognizes the benefit young people get from participating in short-term missions, and we offer financial help when there is a need and when funds are available. Experience has taught us that this sometimes leads to careers in mission work. We have 3 examples, and I wish the participants could tell you in person what the experience meant to them. Youth activities are key to a church's future because it brings families into the congregation. We have skilled planners and organizers to draw on for these activities. There are usually 4 months of the year with 5 Sundays, and for several years the church has organized community service projects on that Sunday. These photos show the type of activities that have been done.
There it is, the story of us. I'm so glad you stayed for the whole thing. It's a big picture, isn't it? A big, long story of God's faithfulness with Union Presbyterian. I regret that all the pastors' wives couldn't be named. They're so important to the job that the pastors have done. It's also too bad that we can't go over every single person in the church, because the church really isn't the building and it really isn't the pastor, but it's everyone. It's all of us. We make up Union. And that's going to continue to be true, even as it is going to continue to be true that God is faithful, then, now, into the future. To God be the glory. Thanks for watching.